he approached her again. "Kemi," he said softly, "you don't need to be afraid. I can take care of you." "Sir, please," Kemi whispered, her voice quivering. "I don't want any trouble. If Madam finds out, Madam doesn't have to know." In the small, bustling town of Ibadan, under the relentless sun, Kemi worked tirelessly in the large, gated house of her madam, Mrs. Adesewa. Life in the village had been unkind to Kemi's family, forcing her to accept this job as a house help at just 16 years old. Her mother had sent her off with a heavy heart, but with the promise that Kemi's earnings would support her younger siblings, she had left home with hope clutched tightly to her chest. From the moment Kemi arrived, her diligence and humility set her apart. Every corner of the house gleamed under her care. Every meal she prepared carried the flavor of her love and talent. Even Mrs. Adesewa had to admit she'd never seen such a hardworking girl. But it was her cooking that truly caught the attention of Mr. Ekinwell, her madam's husband. Each time Kemi brought his meals to the dining table, he would smile broadly and exclaim, "Oh, Kemi, this food is like heaven on earth." At first, Kemi felt shy under his praise, lowering her gaze and murmuring polite thanks. But as time went on, she grew accustomed to it. Kemi took pride in her work, knowing that every task she completed was a step closer to helping her family. She had no other ambition but to save enough to bring her younger siblings out of poverty. One fateful evening, as Kemi carried a tray of steaming jollof rice and fried chicken into the dining room, Mr. Ekinwell looked at her differently. His eyes lingered on her longer than usual, making Kemi uncomfortable. "Thank you, Kemi," he said with a sly smile, his voice lower than usual. Kemi quickly placed the tray on the table and turned to leave, but Mr. Ekinwell spoke again. "Wait, Kemi." She froze, turning back hesitantly. "Yes, sir. You've been working so hard. Come, sit down for a moment. Let me thank you properly." Kemi's heart raced. "No, sir, it's okay. I still have work to do in the kitchen." But Mr. Ekinwell was insistent. "Don't be shy. Come, sit." Reluctantly, Kemi perched on the edge of a chair, clutching her hands nervously. Mr. Ekinwell leaned closer, his cologne filling her nostrils. "You're a very beautiful girl, Kemi. Do you know that?" Her eyes widened in shock. "Sir, I don't understand." He chuckled, reaching out to touch her hand, but she pulled away quickly. "Relax, Kemi. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to show you some appreciation." Kemi stood abruptly. "I think I should go now, sir. Madam will be looking for me." Without waiting for a response, she fled to the safety of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she scrubbed dishes that were already clean. Over the following weeks, Mr. Ekinwell's advances became bolder. He would corner Kemi in the hallway, brush against her unnecessarily, or whisper inappropriate compliments in her ear when no one else was around. Kemi lived in constant fear, avoiding him as much as she could, but in a house where she was the only servant, escape was impossible. One night, as she swept the living room, he approached her again. "Kemi," he said softly, "you don't need to be afraid. I can take care of you." "Sir, please," Kemi whispered, her voice quivering. "I don't want any trouble. If Madam finds out." "Madam doesn't have to know," he interrupted smoothly. "And besides, what has she done for you? You work like a slave in this house while she barks orders at you. I can give you more than she ever will." "I can't," Kemi said firmly, tears welling in her eyes. "I have a family to think about. I need this job. And I'm offering you more," he said, pulling out a wad of cash from his pocket. "Imagine what this can do for your family. Just think about it." He left the money on the table and walked away, leaving Kemi staring at it with a mixture of anger and temptation. The pressure became unbearable. Kemi's refusal seemed only to fuel Mr. Akimwell's determination, and her fear of losing her job grew with each passing day. She knew what was at stake, not just for her, but for her family back home. One evening, after he had cornered her yet again, promising her more money than she had ever dreamed of, Kemi broke down. With tears streaming down her face, she agreed. "Okay," she whispered. "But only this once." The encounter left her feeling hollow and ashamed, but true to his word, Mr. Akimwell gave her a generous sum of money. She sent most of it home, hoping it would ease her family's struggles, but the guilt weighed heavily on her. Weeks turned into months, and Kemi began to notice changes in her body. Her appetite waned, she felt nauseous in the mornings, and her once flat stomach began to swell. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt: she was pregnant. Panic consumed her. How could she explain this to her madam? What would happen if the truth came out? She considered running away but had nowhere to go. One morning, while sweeping the living room, Mrs. Adesewa walked in unexpectedly. She took one look at Kemi and frowned. "Kemi, what's wrong with you? You look different." "Nothing, Ma," Kemi stammered, avoiding her gaze. Mrs. Adesewa's eyes narrowed. "Come here." Kemi hesitated but obeyed. Mrs. Adesewa examined her closely, her suspicion growing. "Are you pregnant?" Kemi's silence was all the confirmation she needed. "Who is responsible for this?" Mrs. Adesewa demanded, her voice rising. "Ma, please, I can explain," Kemi began, but her words were drowned out by Mrs. Adesewa's fury. "You wretched girl," she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By bringing shame into my house?" Kemi fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry, Ma. I didn't mean for this to happen." Before she could say more, Mr. Akimwell entered the room. He froze at the sight of his wife towering over Kemi, her face a mask of rage. "What's going on here?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "Your little house girl is pregnant," Mrs. Adesewa spat. "And I want to know who's responsible." Kemi glanced at him, her eyes pleading for help, but he avoided her gaze. "I have no idea what she's talking about," he said smoothly. "Maybe one of the boys in the neighborhood." Kemi's heart shattered. She had hoped, foolishly, that he would defend her, but he had thrown her to the wolves. Mrs. Adesewa wasted no time in firing Kemi, packing her belongings and sending her back to the village in disgrace. Kemi returned home with nothing but shame and regret, her dreams of helping her family in ruins. Her mother wept when she saw her, but she did not turn her away. She nursed Kemi through her pregnancy, offering comfort and forgiveness even when Kemi couldn't forgive herself. Months later, Kemi gave birth to a baby boy. As she cradled her son, she vowed to protect him from the mistakes and betrayals that had defined her own life. Kemi's story became a cautionary tale in the village, a reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond its borders and the price of silence. But for Kemi, it was also a story of resilience and redemption. She may have lost her innocence, but she refused to lose her hope.